I also wrote one of the very first pieces about your company in October of 1999, which resulted when Larry and Sergey were on a road trip without any PR person at all, and they sat down with me in a conference room and was telling what this thing is, and it was one of the very first pieces that kind of put the stake in the ground that what Google was doing was significantly different and extremely useful. So, yeah, I've been writing about tech for a long time, and if you a lot of people ask, why did I want to write a book about Facebook? And it really rose from all the history I had of writing about Google and Microsoft and other companies that are closely related, and recognizing at a moderately early point that Facebook was unusual, first of all, just plain unusual. And I still think Facebook is extremely unusual in a number of respects, several of which are not fully enough understood, although I really hit on them pretty hard in my book. So it's part of the reason I think I wrote the book was to try to emphasize that Facebook is a truly unusual company. I would say that also applies to Google, obviously. But there are many things about Facebook that even Google doesn't exactly echo, or Facebook doesn't echo Google, since Google was the predecessor. And we can talk about those maybe more in the Q&A, although I'm sure I'll hit on some of them as I go through this. But so in addition, so Facebook, when I first started looking at it in the summer of 2006, was pretty much stereotyped by me and by everyone as more or less a plaything for kids. And I thought of it that way too. And kids meaning college students. By that point, they were also being used a lot in high schools. And I honestly hadn't given it that much thought, even though there was some minor awareness in the back of my mind that it had kind of been coming on moderately strong. I'm based in New York, so I think if I had been out here, I might have been slightly more aware of it at that point. Anyway, so a PR person for Facebook called me in August of '06 and said, did I want to meet Mark Zuckerberg? And I said, yes, of course, why not? I mean, I knew he was interesting. I knew something, I met with a lot of CEOs of tech companies at that time, and throughout the time of my work at Fortune, and I don't work at Fortune anymore, by the way. So I joined him for lunch at an Italian restaurant in Midtown on, I think it was September 6, 2006. And that date is somewhat significant, if that's the correct date, but whatever date it was significant, because it was at the very height of the newsfeed controversy. And it had only been a few days earlier that the newsfeed had launched, and those of you who are students of Facebook will recall that, you may think they've had a privacy controversy recently, but in September of 2006, 10% of all their members were actively protesting the change they had just introduced. Now, they only had 9 million members, but close to 1 million of them were actively protesting the introduction of the newsfeed. Now that, in retrospect, seems kind of odd, considering that anyone who uses Facebook knows that the newsfeed is kind of its central feature, without which it would more or less feel pretty useless. However, when it was introduced, the members did not like it, and even all those, there was hardly anybody to be found who liked it in its first days. So there was this huge protest underway. Have lunch with Zuckerberg. He walks into the restaurant. He'd been up most of the night before writing his famous letter of apology to his members, in which he was announcing that they were making changes and adding some relatively minor, by the way, privacy tweaks that allowed you to have a little more control of how the newsfeed data flowed inside Facebook. But what was really amazing to me, particularly in retrospect, once I sort of digested what had happened, was that he didn't even really want to talk about the controversy. He treated it as more or less a minor matter. He wasn't focused on it in our meeting whatsoever. He was focused entirely on the long-term view, the big picture significance of the service that he was creating, how it was here for the duration, how it was about to launch only a few weeks after that for all adults, people of any age over 13. So that hadn't quite happened. It was still just for students of high schools and colleges at the time when I met him. but they did what they called open registration in about 3 weeks later. They did delay it a few weeks because of all the controversy over the newsfeed. But, you know, especially in retrospect, after I kind of was thinking about the meeting and paid more attention to what was happening in the controversy, just in the days after I had lunch with him, it struck me very strongly that it was extraordinary that he was not feeling the slightest bit burdened by this whole problem. And even, you know, as time passed, that, you know, seemed even more extraordinary. And looking back, I think it's very indicative of the way Mark Zuckerberg thinks. And I also really felt that he was a leader and a thinker and a big picture visionary of a sort that really doesn't come along very often in the technology industry. And I do have the privilege. Somebody can move my coat, and somebody can sit there, by the way, if you want to fit more people in. But, you know, I knew Bill Gates pretty well. I talked a lot to Larry and Sergey. I mean, I knew the people who did this kind of stuff, and he seemed to me like one of the greats of the order of magnitude of those people, you know. And it was really the scope of the vision, the big picture way of thinking, and the ambition. Now, at that time, you couldn't say that he had, you know, executed on it to a superbly impressive extent. At this point, you have to give him credit for that, I'd say. And he still more or less thinks primarily about the long term and the big picture, by the way, which is kind of interesting. And in fact, I think if you were to really get inside his head, which I have done a tiny bit in recent weeks, about what just has happened with the changes they announced at F8 and the reaction that the world had, and, you know, the privacy advocates had, and Chuck Schumer and Al Franken and the other senators who wrote letters to Facebook had, you know, despite all that, in his head, it's a minor perturbation in a much bigger long-term thing. You know, yes, he took a few steps back. You know, 5 steps forward, half a step back is kind of the way I think about the way he operates in these situations. He doesn't really surrender very much, and he didn't really surrender very much recently, just as he really didn't in the newsfeed controversy. I mean, what he did was he basically changed and made a significant percentage of the data that had been forcibly exposed on Facebook opt-in. No, he gave you an opt-out. That's what he did. Which wasn't even available for things like hiding your friend list, right? But in reality, the number of people who are going to take that option and use the opt-out is infinitesimal in the scale of the 500 million users of Facebook that they have roughly at the moment, growing 1 million a day, thereabouts. I mean, people at Google probably aren't as in need of being told some of the basics about Facebook as most of the audiences I speak to, but, you know, we can talk about the numbers and all that stuff if you want. I mean, Facebook's growth is extraordinary. Facebook's social penetration in countries around the world is extraordinary. It is predominantly not an American service, just in case you hadn't focused in on that. Even though there's about 130 million Americans on Facebook, there are 500 million. And in countries like the UK, Canada, little countries like Iceland, big countries like Turkey and Indonesia, you know, the percentage of users, at least of people who are on the internet, is much higher than it is in the United States. Like in the UK and Canada, the percentage of the total population that's on Facebook is substantially higher than in the United States. You know, in the mid to low to mid 40s of the percent of the total population of everybody from age 0 to dead. Whereas in the United States, you know, it's only like 34, 35%, something like that, of all people. But then, you know, in a country like Indonesia, where only maybe 10%, 15% of the population is even on the internet, almost all of them are on Facebook. And that's more or less true in an awful lot of countries that many Americans, I mean, don't think much or nearly enough about. And Turkey is a good example. I think now Indonesia might have just become Facebook's 3rd largest country after the US and the UK. It was formerly Turkey, so those countries are especially interesting. I don't even know exactly why it's those countries that have picked up so much, but I will say that those are the kinds of countries that Facebook is most targeting right now for its growth, which is the whole world, the most populous countries, regardless of where they are. And actually, my very lengthy outline of my talk here has global down at the bottom, but since I'm talking about that, one of the things that that is interesting to think about with Facebook is, if you look at what is Mark Zuckerberg's personal goal for his service and what is the strategic direction that Facebook itself considers itself to be pursuing, one aspect of it is a word that they do actually use, which is ubiquity. And it's a somewhat hubristic notion for most companies, although probably not for yours, but there are not too many companies that it wouldn't be hubristic even to talk about such a thing. But at Facebook, it is certainly not, considering that in 6 years they've already gotten about a third of all the people in the world who are on the internet to use this thing actively. But the vision is to basically provide, so let me just talk about the vision and then I'll get back to a global point. Facebook's strategy is long-term, not really to get the whole world using Facebook, but to transform itself into infrastructure so that all the changes that they announced at the recent F8 conference, in which their platform was effectively, for the first time, very aggressively extended to be usable by sites and partners outside of Facebook's own confines, that was very strongly indicative of the company's long-term strategic direction. Their goal, I don't think Mark Zuckerberg believes that he can really win or even really survive by competing with all of the competitors that are inevitably going to target him over time as his company gets such massive footprint and scale in terms of usage. Like a company they think about a lot right now, for example, is Foursquare. This kind of thing scares them because little companies with really good ideas that do related things can come on extremely quickly and get a lot of enthusiasm really fast. And in the long run, the sort of legacy problem, the thing that, you could argue has been in the process of killing Microsoft for 10 years, is going to, if Facebook just stays Facebook.com, it will kill it at some point. That's, to me, a given. However, and I think that's a given to them too, and to Mark in particular. However, they have a unique opportunity because of their scale, and because of the nature of what they do, and because of the fact that they have uniquely convinced people to make Facebook into an identity repository for personal data and a repository for connectivity, for the social graph as they call it, the network of relationships among your friends, the friends of any member of Facebook. That is their core asset. The fact that they have convinced you to put your data in there and to articulate your friend relationships. And so the strategy is to turn the whole thing into infrastructure, to go beneath the surface of the internet. And if there's any other commercial company that's ever succeeded at anything like that, it is your own, although Google still operates kind of above the surface of the internet with a website, but in reality, the nature of its use is almost arguably infrastructural just because of the overwhelming ubiquity practically of people who do use the service. But I don't know whether Google has ever actually thought of it quite this way, and I don't think it's quite as appropriate. But in Facebook's case, they believe that if they can effectively extend their platform for the usage of anyone, my website, your personal website, Coca-Cola.com, US.gov, .gov, whatever, any entity, then they have a unique set of assets that are truly valuable, employed anywhere on the internet in order to bring your friend relationships with you and turn any experience social. And to really extend that to the ultimate extent, if you believe, as I do, and is obvious to probably most of you, the internet is becoming a mobile device phenomenon. The internet increasingly is going to be with us everywhere. I used Google Maps like 3 times on my way here, and I actually probably use Google more on this device now than on my laptop, which is my other computer, which, now that I have, an iPad and this, I actually really do use the laptop less. It's the mobile things, this is not surprising to you, but anyway, but if you think of it that way, and you take these devices a few more steps in their logical evolutionary direction. I haven't stood in line for the iPhone 4 yet, but I will. And then I'll get the smaller one and the faster one and the one that you guys do with HTC or whatever. And the world will, I believe. So if that's true, then basically this thing Facebook wants to do, which is to be a tool that partners with you wherever you go on the internet. It's going to be everywhere you go. It's going to be your whole life, potentially. That's the goal. I mean, I'm sure that's the goal Google thinks about too, and you're doing a pretty good job of it. But Facebook would like to be a tool that you employ regardless of what you're doing, period. And I know, so that one way I try to explain that in terms of what would that mean, you should be able to, and I'm sure you will, and Google's working on aspects of this too. Just walk down the street, turn your device on or just glance at your device, which will probably always be on, and, learn whether there's anything in the vicinity that was of interest to your friends. Not to mention any of your friends that might be in the vicinity. If you choose to have that kind of information given to you, it will be trivially easy to provide that to you in the architecture that we're building in the internet, and that Facebook is a key critical component of, in my opinion, because they are the ones who have those friend connections. Okay, so that's the goal. And so they don't think they can compete as a website, and their corporate strategy is to diminish their role as Facebook.com website and to transit their role to the far more defensible strategic position of being infrastructure, which nobody but them could do currently, and therefore they want to get as quickly as possible to that place where they are, underneath the surface doing a unique set of functions that no one else could mimic. In a minute, if I don't remember, remind me to talk about the policy and governmental implications of that, because I find them quite interesting, and there's not a slam dunk that they're going to get from here to there. However, okay, going back to the global point, if their goal is global ubiquity, there is one fundamental problem I think it's interesting to think about, probably especially for you here at Google, that they have to solve, and that is China. Because China is where the world's largest mass of internet users reside, and if Facebook seeks to be an infrastructure for the internet, you can't succeed at that if the largest group of internet users aren't using you. And so, Mark even said at a speech he gave this week, I think he said Russia, China, Japan, and one other country, I forget which one it was, are their primary strategic growth targets right now, and basically their primary strategic targets. But it's interesting that even he says that, considering Facebook doesn't operate at all in China right now. It's turned off by the government. No, it isn't turned off by the government. Well, maybe it is, but Facebook hasn't even really tried. At one point, maybe they had, 75,000, 100,000 users in China, not millions, I don't believe. Now, the only people that use Facebook in China are government employees, and maybe 20,000 of them, or 30,000. But Facebook's effectively not used in China. Their dilemma here is not at all dissimilar to yours, which is, it's a company committed to the free flow of information. How do you operate in a country that is not committed to the free flow of information, that is the largest company in the world on the internet? And, I wish you luck in resolving that problem. And to them too, but I will just tell you that's something they're thinking about really hard at Facebook. So let me see how much time I've already eaten up. I want to wrap it fairly soon, but just let me quickly say what I think Facebook does that makes it different. I see it as a viral communications tool that in some ways can be defined as the next phase of communication beyond email. That's an extreme statement in some people's opinion, but I believe there's something fundamentally different about the way that Facebook's communications architecture was designed, which allows you to essentially, basically they turned people into RSS feeds, kind of, to think of it technically. And that was new. That was very, very new, and it was putting out the news feed that enabled them to do that. And another aside, I'm a big aside guy, I'm not a very linear thinker, but it's an irony in all the comparisons between Twitter and Facebook, and how Facebook took so much from Twitter a couple years ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, and more or less tried to co-opt their business by building, which they failed to do, by the way, but they certainly took the features and put them in Facebook. But in reality, Twitter borrowed enormously from Facebook in its fundamental design from day one, because Facebook pioneered this notion of a feed about people, which Twitter is also built around. And that was a huge, innovation that Facebook, Zuckerberg, pioneered in September of 2006 when I met him. But what it does, the way I look at it is all communication between people, pretty much, certainly ordinary people, before Facebook came along, were based around an outbound effort to communicate. So I would send a letter to you, a telegram, make a phone call, make an outbound effort to communicate. Facebook doesn't require that. Facebook sets up a scenario where people subscribe to one another, and all you do as a user is act. You just say, I'm going to the bathroom, or one of these, banal things that people ridicule Facebook for containing, or you say, I've joined the group, protesting that Mossavi had the election stolen from him, or whatever in Iran. But you just do something, and then that is transmitted algorithmically and by the software to whoever has subscribed to you by saying they're your friend. And I call that, in a certain sense, automating communication in a way that it has never been automated before. And I assert in the book, and people in here know a lot more than I do about certain things, but I say it's, to me, the introduction of automation to communication for the first time. And interestingly, I don't think Zuckerberg thinks of it that way. He doesn't actually think of Facebook as communication, which is interesting, but that's a more complicated conversation. I don't even fully understand why. But Facebook has this automated way of disseminating information about people, which I think was essentially fundamentally new, and again required the newsfeed. And it takes advantage of this extraordinary virality that occurs because of the connectivity that they set up in the social graph, so that information, when it is welcomed by a group, can spread with extraordinary rapidity between communities, or, throughout communities. And you see that in something like the role that Facebook played in the election of Barack Obama. It was very, very reinforcing to learn that your friends had joined a group supporting him, therefore it was easy for you to join a group supporting him, and the fact that you did was then conveyed automatically to your friends, and then, that's a very rapid process of, based on network effects and all that Facebook not uniquely, but very powerfully, as part of its system, enables. And the other thing about Facebook here's a little thing, and not time to talk about everything in any individual talk, but if you ask why did Facebook succeed when MySpace, Friendster, others failed, there's a number of reasons. The biggest single reason is that Facebook was based on genuine identity from the beginning. So it was your real name and your real friend relationships in more or less your real social graph. Facebook can be gamed. I mean, I was on this Ron Owens radio show yesterday, and the producer was telling me how his wife set up a Facebook page for their dog, which has 700 friends. And that does happen. And also people create fake personas to play Farmville and other games, or Mafia Wars more than Farmville. But so there's a lot of fake identities in Facebook, but that's still not primarily what it's used for, and it's pretty good at pushing its users towards being authentic, and nothing that preceded it ever did that well. Friendster tried and totally failed. MySpace didn't even try. But a lot of the things that Facebook makes possible, the thing I was talking about when you're walking down the street, you couldn't do that if you didn't have genuine identity and genuine friend relations. It would be pointless. I mean, I don't care what some, handle, who I don't even know the person behind, liked about the store I'm walking by, or, didn't want to drink the water at this drinking fountain, and that kind of thing is what I think you're going to be able to know. But, so I'm going quickly, but I feel like you guys can probably handle that. So the book is called The Facebook Effect. It is the inside story. It's very much a history of the company, and it's a really fun business book to read. And it's funny because it's a real business book, and I really think, and a lot of people tell me, it's really fun to read because the anecdotes that emerge from the story of a company founded by a bunch of 19-year-olds are pretty frickin' amazing. I mean, you know, it's just, and especially the role of Sean Parker, who was one of the great figures in Facebook's history, who was truly an iconoclast and brought his iconoclastic sensibility to Facebook, and it's still very much manifest in the product design today. And he's the one that allowed Mark to acquire, by the way, the ability, this absolute control he has, where he controls 3 out of 5 board seats, and nothing can be done. You know, at your company, you know, there's a lot of power rested in the founders, but I don't know of any big company where there's one guy who absolutely cannot be removed, cannot be deposed. 3 out of 5 board seats, no matter what, Zuckerberg will be there if he wants to be there. He will squash anything he does not want to see happen. That's it, period. And Sean Parker architected that in the very early days. And anyway, so back to the effect. You know, when I call it the Facebook effect, even though it's a history, what I really am trying to imply is that Facebook has this very interesting range of effects in the world, which are in, you know, politics, government, media, marketing, identity, you know, personal relations, etc. And the politics is one that I find particularly interesting, and it happens that Mark Zuckerberg is also quite obsessed with. And the book begins in a way that I think a lot of people find surprising. It's not a Facebook scenario. It begins in the bedroom of a 32-year-old computer programmer in the middle of the night in Barranquilla, Colombia in January 2008, who was just fed up with the FARC guerrilla movement killing and kidnapping his countrymen over the previous decades. And there was a recent story of really abusing a small child, and he's a very sensitive kid. He's a real sensitive soul, this guy, Oscar Morales. And he just got fed up, and he's a computer guy, so he knew how to make a Facebook page and do some good graphics, and he did that at 3 a.m., went to bed, and he sent an invitation to all his friends to join the group, and in the morning he had, I think, 1,200 members of the group when he woke up. And he only had 150 friends or something like that, so that got his attention, and then he went to the beach that day and came home, and there were, I don't know, I forget the numbers, 4,000 friends or something like that. And then, you know, I love this quote. He says, "I decided to stop going to the gym and just focus on," you know, and a month to the day after that, he created it. There was a demonstration in the streets of Colombia of 10 million people with a simple message: FARC, stop killing, stop kidnapping, you know, no more lies. And it was very simple, and it really just was the message that was poised to be received by the country at that time, and it was Facebook that enabled it to happen. So that kind of thing happens in a lot of places. I think, you know, the actual impact of it is still hard to say at the moment, but it is the feeling of members of Facebook that if they're upset about anything, whether it's political or non-political, Facebook is a very good place to say that, and the message can spread very rapidly, and that has a lot of political implications. The effects in marketing, et cetera, are things we could talk about because they're very big. But I've sort of already talked about the future. Zuckerberg, I mean, I think I've kind of hit on the main points that I like to highlight, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions, so let's go right to a dialogue. I think you have to go over there to the mic in order to talk in any form, because there's people from at like 3 or 4 other locations that are watching this.
Hey there. So I work in the PR department, and full disclosure, I answer a lot of questions about Facebook all the time. One thing that kind of bothers me about it, and you touched on this earlier, is that if Facebook strategically wants to be the social plumbing under everything, they want
that's
to
a
own
good way
that
to put it, yeah.
They want to own that
Social
social
plumbing,
graph.
I like that, yeah.
Every time you want to reference that, you know, you ping their API and you get it back.
Uh-huh.
But the problem with that is they're owning something that belongs to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
I own my address book. I know that little black book, and that's something that I carry with me. If I want to
Right.
export my Gmail contacts, I can do that.
Right.
But with Facebook, it's somehow telling me that I don't own the set of relationships between me and other people.
Yeah.
And so there seems to be some kind of tension between the data that I own about myself and their strategic vision. Could
Well,
you kind of
technically
go into that?
speaking, during the terms of service controversy of a year or so ago, they altered that, and they don't technically claim to own your data anymore, although they did before that. They do, in practical fact, control your data. and they don't let you export it nearly so easily as most other services do. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they begin to allow that going forward, just because of the many policy implications and legal implications of their ambition. That I think they're going to have to move in a number of respects toward a more opt-in architecture rather than the opt-out architecture, which is really one of the reasons they've had so much, difficulty on the privacy front. So I think it's a legitimate point, and the thing is, it's user beware. That's the thing you have to. I mean, it's just on practical terms, the members of Facebook don't pay anything. They like using it, and they put that stuff in there because they get benefits from it. If that stopped being the case, they would remove their data. And Facebook's great challenge is to make sure they continue to feel that the trade-off is worth it. And so far, there's no question that they've succeeded at that. But from an intellectual point of view, your point is totally justified, and I think that that kind of thing is just starting to sink in on the world, and how the world responds and how Facebook responds to the world in that regard is very important. And so that's all I'd say about that. But I want to say one other thing before I go to the next question, about Google, because I meant to do that in my talk. Facebook and Google's relationship and connectivity and the comparison between the two is really, really fascinating. And has anybody here actually read my book already, by the way? Well, I think you have a great opportunity in your future. Anyway, oh, good, you read it, good. Well, the last chapter is a lot about Google, right? And just quickly, I think it's worth mentioning, and I'm sure some of you will have reactions to some of this, but Facebook is a problem for Google in a number of respects, three primary respects, in my opinion. I mean, and if I were you, I would say it's probably your biggest single problem, in terms of competitively, and which is why I think it's not wrong that so many people are sitting in this room trying to, sitting on the floor, because if the leaders of Google and the people who are making policy decisions about Google and where Google's going, if you don't focus on what Facebook is doing to alter the landscape in which you operate, you're naive, and you're not naive at all in this company. So, here's the three ways that I think Facebook is a problem for Google. I think the number one way is that Google's corporate mandate and mantra is to search all the world's information. And Facebook is aggregating the largest quantity of digital information that anybody is aggregating at the moment, I believe, certainly of any commercial company, and the vast majority of it is not visible to you. Therefore, if you're trying to search everything on the internet, it's not a good thing that the biggest growing piece of the internet data, universe is invisible to your crawling tools. There's an irony in that, by the way, which is that almost everything Mark Zuckerberg has been doing recently that he's getting in trouble for would help you with that problem, because he wants everyone to use the everyone privacy setting. And this is the really way. Mark Zuckerberg is not an easy person to, he's not easy to intuitively understand, because he's very principled, very intellectual, and not a business-minded person by instinct. He is trying to change the world more than he's trying to make money, and that is always a controversial statement, but that is the case about him. I think, at least for most of the history of Google, that same thing was true about Larry and Sergey, and probably to a larger degree is still true. I mean, Google's so much more mature of a company that it's much harder to maintain that attitude than it is for Mark at Facebook. But anyway, so Mark's trying to make everyone make all their information visible, which, if that succeeded, then Facebook wouldn't have that problem. But at the moment, most users of Facebook are still hiding a lot of their data. I don't even know the percentage. A very rapidly growing percentage of data inside Facebook is searchable by anyone, so that's good. The second thing is that Facebook is the most targetable medium in history, because it is full of user-identified data. The users volunteer data about themselves, which is very different from the way DoubleClick and other systems identify people's interests and behavior, what I call, or what is I think logically called inferential reasoning. You observe people and figure out what they probably want and who they probably are. But it's far better to have them just tell you, and in Facebook's case, they do. Therefore, to the degree Google's in the advertising business, which of course it is, Facebook's a problem, because if that kind of advertising works well, which there are some signs it's beginning to work better and better in their universe, you've got to get even better at the inferential stuff, or else you've got to get access to volunteered data. And then the third piece, which is closely related to the second one, is that, you know, Google's business in large part through AdSense is a, you know, ad distribution business, an ad network business, and Facebook has not gone into that business yet. But if you dovetail this commercial stuff with what I said before about their strategic goal of becoming infrastructure, and you know, the Facebook Connect system and the like button and all that stuff, and just imagine what happens when, not if, but in my opinion, when they begin to distribute advertising using that same infrastructure with all of the user-reported data behind it. So then they begin to compete with AdSense on any website by telling the website, we know who that person is and what they say they're interested in, not what we've guessed. And then they probably don't even, you know, they could split the revenue in a lot of different ways with that partner site and target people with extraordinary accuracy. And so, you know, those are three big challenges for Google that I just didn't want to get out of here without saying clearly. So go ahead.
Hello. So, I guess, you know, in advance, I want to apologize for this question, and I totally understand if you don't really want to talk about it from a personal or a legal kind of point of view. But what do you think, you know, personally, is wrong with Facebook? You know, whether it's from a technical or a political or, you know, just kind of an overall like philosophical point of view.
Well, there's plenty of things that are wrong with the way it's moving and with the decisions it's making. I mean, I am, as you could probably tell, something of an enthusiast about its significance. And, you know, because I've been an enthusiast or a believer in its significance for a long time, you know, I sometimes sound like I'm, you know, a cheerleader was a word that Michael Arrington used to me in private, which he did not use in his very two-sided review of my book the other day, although he did say you should read it, by the way, in case you didn't notice that. But, I mean, I think Facebook has not wrestled with the fundamental question of how they can function as a commercial enterprise. I mean, basically, their ambition is highly questionable from a policy point of view. You know, why should a company own identity, you know, infrastructure? That, you know, in the history of mankind, to the degree such things existed, that has been a governmental function. Now, the argument that you could rebut that with, and this is why, I mean, you know, I don't think Facebook is evil or not evil. I think there's a, you know, things are nuanced in my mind. I'm a journalist and I've never been I'm not really a classic blogger type who like makes these extreme statements just to see what people think. I really look at the world in a fairly nuanced way. I don't think Google is either evil or not evil either. But, although I did once write a piece saying Google is not evil. But anyway. The problem with the problem, if you call that a problem, is that, you know, Facebook really is enabling people to do new things that probably could not be done if they hadn't emerged. And people like that. That's why they have 1 million new users a day coming in there, and they have 500 million active users. I mean, you know, inarguably, they're providing something that people like. And it's impossible to imagine that governments could ever have invented it. I mean, governments are clueless about this stuff. So, you know, you could legitimately ask, maybe should Facebook in some future scenario possibly be regulated by the ITU? Or, you know, I don't think so necessarily, but believe me, the ITU is going to start wondering in a few years if they don't start wondering soon. And someone at Facebook who I was talking to yesterday said, you know, if you keep talking like this, the government officials may start regulating us sooner rather than later. I said, well, you know, that's the breaks. Yeah, I think this regulation thing is real, and you're encountering it. You know, look at the 40 countries, or however many countries. How many countries are now suing you because of the Street View cameras? I don't know. 30 states, 15 countries. Thank you. So, you know, you're encountering it already, right? And no, nobody's going to argue Google's not a good thing for the average user, but you know, there's these nuanced situations when you acquire these incredibly complex, ambitious, successful systems that are deployed in the hundreds of millions bring about tons of issues. I think, you know, I don't think of wrong or right, but I'll tell you a huge challenge that I think Facebook faces, which is Mark Zuckerberg's personality. You know, and I think, you know, this company faced the same challenge, and they solved it by hiring Eric Schmidt. Mark is a geek, computer scientist type person, and that's the way he sees the world, through the product and engineering lens. And he's basically inclined to solve every product problem by redesigning the product. And that's a fine thing, and it's worked pretty well. But if you watched his D speech, or if you've read a lot of the commentary about him recently, you can't deny that that's not the only thing he has to do. He has to become an ambassador, a policy expert, a policy articulator, a front man, a marketer, in a way that he's probably personally uncomfortable to be, and maybe not capable of being, although knowing how much he's matured in the mere 6 years since he's run this thing, I would not put it past him at all that he could become that person. But he's not that person now, which is why he totally screwed up at D. So from Facebook's point of view, Mark Zuckerberg's personality is, a problem.
Thank you.
Not necessarily a long-term problem. It could be resolved. But right now, I think, he's got to get better at something he doesn't like to do.
Hi, so one of the things I've been wondering is, Facebook doesn't seem to pick its battles very much. It's competing with Zynga on the payment platform. It's competing with Foursquare and Gowalla and the location and mobile services. It's competing with Google on user attention. It's competing with open web advocates about who owns information. What do you think is the psychology behind that? Why aren't
Well,
they
I would say
picking
most
this
of
battle?
those competitions are inadvertent. I mean, honestly, it's not seeking to compete in that way with any of those players, certainly not with Google on attention. By that logic, you'd say, if you get successful, you've made the mistaken decision to compete with Google. I mean, that's a very, talk about hubris, I'm sorry, but that's not a very logical point. I'm sorry. But anyway, Facebook is just doing what it's doing, and in order to achieve what they think they want to do, which is to provide all these services to their users based on identity and the social graph, they have to go into identity-based information. Now, will they buy Foursquare or build something to compete with it? That's unknown. I actually think, they do pick their battles. That's why they really just want to be infrastructure. That's what I tried to say before. They don't really think they can win those battles the way you describe them in general, unless they become a service that you just use and that nobody effectively can compete with. I mean, and that's a complicated and challenging, idea. But it's kind of you could say that Facebook's gamble is kind of all or nothing, but maybe not, because, they could build this ad network and they could still be Facebook.com and they could be around for a long time because they've got a lot of critical mass. When you talk about, each one of those things is very different also. The Zynga issue, it's not like, this thing of Facebook credits is really what you're asking about. And Facebook credits are, if you don't know, Facebook's got this new business, which is selling its users a credit for $1 and giving these partners 70 cents. And the partners are primarily game companies, and the money is primarily used to buy virtual goods in games and game tools. And the thing that's two-sided about that, even for Zynga, is that even though Zynga doesn't want to give 30% to Facebook, it wants those people to be spending money inside Farmville. And they are generally, in Facebook, more inclined to spend their money on Facebook than they are on Zynga, because if you buy $1's worth of credit from Facebook, you can use it in Zynga, and you can also use it at CrowdStar or another platform. It's a currency that can be used across the network, and if you buy it only from Zynga, then you're stuck to use it in Zynga. And if you think that digital currency has a future, which I do, I think Facebook's well positioned to be a player in that arena, so they're not making a mistake at all to try to get in that business. But specifically with Zynga, they had secret negotiations. They came to a concord. Zynga's got a lot better deal than they had before, would be my guess. Zynga has leverage over Facebook because it's its largest advertiser, or at least it was last year by all accounts. So, but this issue of, I would say the most interesting part of your question, which had a lot of pieces actually, was this issue of how does it relate to its platform partners? And does it compete with them, or does it only help them? And I think in technology platforms generally, it's never black or white. I mean, Microsoft did a very, very good job on balance, serving as a platform and creating this incredible pro-developer culture and enabling all these applications to emerge. You guys haven't done as much of that as I would have expected you to do by now, by the way, but you're doing some of it, certainly. And, you know, there's really a devil's bargain, you could say, that a lot of companies are faced with right now, which is, do you build on top of the Facebook platform and get this viral growth potential, which is incredibly powerful, at the price that you are effectively dependent on Facebook's future decisions, and possibly at risk that they might choose to go into your business and just render you irrelevant overnight. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, Foursquare and Gowalla are in that position right now, that if Facebook does do location-based in a way that's analogous to what those companies are doing, then, you know, they'll probably have a hard time going forward. But Facebook doesn't really want to kill them, because those two companies are built on the Facebook platform, and that's basically how they get users. You know, so, you know, ecosystem management on technology platforms is a very challenging managerial and business issue, which I find fascinating. I've written about it a lot over the years, and, you know, I don't think it's black or white, but it's a really good question that's, you know, almost unanswerable. Nobody's lined up. Shall I just keep talking? Nobody has questions or comments? Do we get questions or comments from the other locations, or do they just have to be mute? They're muted? But do they have the technical ability to ask questions? No, not. Okay. Let's see how much more time we have. You've been sated with Facebook information? Come on, somebody in here must think I said something that was totally full of shit. Am I entitled to say that word? Could somebody just tell me what you disagree with about the things that I've said? Yeah. You got to go to the mic, though. I'm sorry. Hey, you're a professional spokes guy. I know. Complain to your colleagues. What can I say?
Just that you keep saying that Facebook is very unique. You can only do things on Facebook, and this thing wouldn't have it at Facebook. You gave the example in Colombia. I don't think that's true. I think Facebook is one way to do that thing, but it probably would have happened some other way. And it's not that Facebook has capabilities that are hard to replicate or technically interesting. You can be social using a flare gun, you know, if you have to.
Yeah.
So I think you're just seeing trends in society emerging at a time when this thing came out as a tool that people can use. And it's not going to be sticky because you can't do things elsewhere.
Yeah, but you could also say there was always a library, so why did you need Google? You know, I mean, when things are automated and when digital technology is brought to a human task and it's faster, it often becomes fundamentally different, in my opinion. So you could do social things with a flare gun, but the fact that you can do them with digital tools that are so much more efficient is often, in my opinion, fundamentally different. So we differ on that, perhaps. But certainly with Twitter, you can do a lot of things you do in Facebook. You know, the thing I think is one of the things that I think is really unique about Facebook, or is unique about it, which kind of I think goes to your point, is that Facebook draws in users to do very quotidian things, meaning, you know, to communicate with their friends about going to the mall. You know, that's how people start using it, or to connect with their high school girlfriend, to speak in my generation, you know. But once they're in there, these other capabilities, you know, Oscar Morales joined Facebook to communicate with his high school friends. That's a fact, right? But then he got in Facebook, and he kind of just stumbled on the fact that it had this ability to create a group, and that it also would therefore allow him to make a political statement. And that is different than a lot of the other ways it might have emerged, which probably would have had to be a little more willful. That would be, you know, I do probably, you know, books are often written by some degree of overstatement. In fact, I hardly imagine a book that wasn't. So obviously, in order to make a point, sometimes I oversimplify, and I don't deny that. But I think in general, Facebook is different in many of its qualities and capabilities than anything that has preceded it. I do.
Since you mentioned Twitter, could you comment on the relationship between Twitter and Facebook?
Sure. I mean, I think Twitter is a hugely important business and system, not so much business, obviously, but yet. But they're not the same in the way they're often compared. I mean, Twitter isn't really a social network by the classic definitions of social networks because you don't articulate a connection between two people in Twitter. You subscribe to an entity which is tweeting. And that is a hugely valuable thing, but it's not like what Facebook does, which primarily creates bidirectional connections. And I don't think most of the journalists who've written about Twitter versus Facebook fully understood that. So the interesting thing about the Twitter versus Facebook competition, which is a real competition, is, you know, Facebook did get really terrified of Twitter at a certain point in time, primarily because just how fast it was growing at that point. And they said, well, if it's growing that fast, maybe it's doing something we should do. And, you know, they are paranoid, and so they really did. First, they tried to buy it, according to all accounts. I think you guys have thought about that a few times. Maybe you still should. In fact, almost everywhere I go, somebody says Google should buy Twitter. Whatever that's worth. I don't know if it's right. But then Facebook basically did copy much of what's in Twitter. But what's interesting about that to me is that even though in Facebook you can do a lot of the functions that Twitter offers in many ways better than the way you can do them in Twitter, like a Facebook page, which is much like a hashtag identity in Twitter, is actually a more functional environment in many respects to do that kind of thing. But what's very interesting to me is that still the most authentic, powerful, respected, intellectual, interesting voices are primarily using Twitter for that kind of one-to-many messaging. And that's a problem for Facebook. And I don't think Twitter is going away. I don't think no matter what Facebook does in any near-term scenario, Twitter is going away. But by a lot of things that I've heard, Twitter's growth has slowed. So it doesn't threaten Facebook the way it used to. And now Facebook is so much bigger than Twitter, even, you know, relatively more than it was when they first got paranoid about it, I think. Maybe not relatively, but, you know, Facebook is more than double the size it was when they first worried about Twitter, right? You know, it was probably, when they first worried about Twitter, would have been like the beginning of 2009, 8, I don't know. It's been a long time, and they've grown several hundred million since then. So I think they're maybe a little more relaxed about it, but they, you know, they watch that company very closely. And if I were at Facebook, I would really be strategically thinking very hard, how do I get those really credible voices, you know, why is it that when Medvedev came to Google, the photo was of him doing his first tweet, or wherever it was. Was it here that he did that? He did it on his trip to Silicon Valley, right? Medvedev there was a photograph of him in the paper tweeting for the first time. You know, that's a problem for Facebook. They would have liked to see him doing a Facebook message for the first time, you know. So, you know, it's a big, really good question and a really big issue, but not as understood as it ought to be, in my opinion.
Great. So let's give David a round of applause. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. I enjoyed it.